And welcome to our webinar. It's great to be with you all. Looks as if we've got quite a few in our audience, which is fantastic. While we're joining, I shall just to let you know, my name's David Saab. Those of you that don't know me, I'm the Mental Wellbeing Champion and Business Alliance Manager here at the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce. Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce is the one of 53 accredited chambers with the British Chambers of Commerce, and we're the voice of business for the Thames Valley region. Today we've got a fantastic lineup for you. I'm really excited about today's webinar, and I'm so grateful that so many of you continue to join us. I'm going to just throw some thoughts at you while we're still welcoming our audience, and then I'm going to hand over to our chair. So some thoughts that I've had. I was going for a walk a couple of weeks ago. We have some fields near the house. It was my lunchtime walk. I wanted some fresh air, and I bumped into one of my mental wellbeing contacts who had come to a webinar previously, and she was very gracious and said how much she was enjoying it, and we had a little bit of a discussion, and then out of the blue she said to me that mental health shouldn't be dealt with at work and should be kept entirely separate from one's employer. And this, as you can imagine, kind of took me back. Hang on, what about reducing the stigma and all we're doing? And we had a discussion, and she's a mid-manager, professional, and this was her strongly felt opinion. She basically said management needs to know that they can rely on someone to get the job done, and having poor mental health is just seen as a weakness, no matter what management may say. I can hear the gasps in the audience, and this got me thinking. This was an incredibly sharp woman who had this opinion. And another conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's a business leader said, we're making the well-being of our people a priority, but the boardroom's focus will always be dominated by business results. And when these are poor, the focus is not on well-being, ED&I or net zero. These will always run second fiddle. So I'm just throwing these thoughts out there. I know further gasps, and you're all ready to hack down these people. So all of you are working so hard to train mental health first aiders, to raise awareness, to signpost our people to resources. And the resounding message back is we need cultural change. We need to change management's thinking, and this needs to be a top-down approach. But having said that, I think it's worthwhile just keeping one eye on the question: are we reaching the ones that really do need help? I know we are reaching, but this is the challenge that we have. Another friend of mine I was speaking to last week, literally had such a rough day with depression and head in hands, teary, and confided to me that even though they're surrounded by a great mental health first aid team and a supportive boss, he just couldn't bring himself to mention anything. And I even shared a post, this was last week, with my church group. I go to church, and it was about depression. And so I shared some thoughts. My view was I wanted people to know that the struggle is real, and it was just kind of, hey, we can still have faith and have a spiritual outlook, but the struggle is real. And I got lots of comments back, lots of, some people wanted to rescue me and some people wanted to support me. Some people just wanted to say, yeah, the struggle is real and all that. But not one of them was a man. They were all women, which I think highlights the fact that we're still in this, blokes don't want to talk about mental health. So here we are today at this webinar, called together by a common desire to try and support our people. And today we've gathered some excellent speakers. I'm really looking forward to this because we're looking at the NHS. Now, the NHS is a beast in itself, isn't it? And look at what they've gone through. Look at what their people have gone through over the past 18 months, 2 years. And we're going to learn today from two of our speakers how they really supported the people. And I'm really looking forward to that. And then we have some fantastic insights into leadership. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our chair for this session, Dr. Carole Kaplan, who will help us set the scene and introduce our speakers. Carole's career has centered on professional and voluntary work, providing advice and expertise in a number of different areas, spanning the healthcare of children, their protection in law, adult relationships, and dispute resolution, as well as the improvement of health service systems. In addition, as an academic, she has significant teaching and research experience. Having retired from clinical work as a consultant child psychiatrist, she now works as director of a transformation program in Cumbria, Northumberland, Tyne and Wear NHS Foundation Trust. This program has supported significant and outstanding improvement in clinical and corporate mental health and rehab care delivery. As a result, the program, known as the Trust Innovation Group, now offers support to other organisations wishing to improve and sustain the services they deliver. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our capable chair, Carole, and I'll see you all at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this group. The sessions that I've attended so far have all been really interesting and also very inspiring, and I look forward to this one. The subject today, working through the pandemic and beyond, is an interesting one. We've all had to struggle through the pandemic, and in many ways we are the survivors of the pandemic, which has been described by many people as being the biggest challenge in a generation. And I think that's probably very accurate for many people. What I would ask you to remember, though, is this might have been one of the biggest challenges that we face in the Western world. In some of the other parts of the world, it has only been part of many challenges that people have faced: fire, flood, etc., war, and so that it has had to augment the disaster situation that has taken place elsewhere in the world, which of course has made us, I hope, count our blessings in a weird kind of a way. It's also been a very strange situation because everybody says we were unexpected, we were certainly unprepared, or at the very least we were preparing for a different kind of a problem. And both people and organizations have dealt with this in different ways. I'm very interested to hear what they've been doing in Oxford and also what Lisa has to say about how people have been coping with this. We've struggled up north in the NHS and in other organizations that I work in. And I think probably one of the most useful things that I've come across is a piece of work that comes from disaster management, which has been around for really quite a long time, which describes the stages that one might go through in much the same way as the stages of bereavement that have been described for people who have lost close members of their families or people who have generally been loved by them. And of course, that is relevant to the pandemic that we've been through because many people have been bereaved during the pandemic. But if we look at the population as a whole, 6 stages are described, and I'm just going to say what they are very briefly. There is the pre-disaster where there's a kind of, oh my goodness, what's happening to us, and an impact, which is shock, horror, how are we going to cope? And then having realized the extent of what is going on, we then interestingly go into a so-called heroic phase. It's interesting that the NHS staff members were often described as heroes and treated as such. I have to tell you that many members of staff that I know, colleagues that I'm close to, have felt that they really did not deserve that epithet and flatly refused to accept the accolades from the grateful public. But the heroic phrase applies to all of us, because at that point in time, you can actually see, as it were, the light at the end of the tunnel, which is not an oncoming train, but it feels as if you can see the end, and that we are going to be survivors. We're going to be the heroes who come out the other end. And there's a honeymoon phase where you start to celebrate that and release some of the anxiety and depression, I suppose, that many of us have. And so then everyone gets filled with hope, and then you get disillusionment, because people are stressed, they're exhausted, and they're also discouraged, because when is it ever going to end? I'm sure many of you would empathize with that kind of a view. And it's only when we come out of disillusionment that we're able to enter the reconstruction phase, which is where we're able to assume responsibility for what happened and also for moving forward. And there's the key issue here of, we've been through an extraordinary experience. Are we going to learn from it, both good things and bad things to be learned from? And how are we going to move forward in a stronger way? So I'm very interested to hear how our speakers approach this particular issue, because it's the and beyond for me, which is the key issue that we would tackle today. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce firstly Ben, who comes from the Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust. He describes himself as a change professional, and he's had experience in management, consultancy, and also in the local authority, particularly important if we're all going to work together in the future. He's been closely involved in the response and recovery relating to COVID, and this has been a key strategic piece of work that he has done, as well as being a trustee in the response charity. He's going to do a presentation, as I understand it, with Ros. Ros also works in the Oxford Health NHS Trust. She's got 41 years of experience in the NHS. That's nearly as much as me, Ros. She's head of health, wellbeing and stress, and she's also been a key player in the implementation of the NHSE standards, which are so important in keeping health service provision to an acceptable level. Both Ben and Ros have been closely involved in the strategy and planning around the COVID response, and I very much look forward to their presentation. Thank you. I'll hand over to Ben.
Thank you, Carole, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Cahill. I work for Oxford Health. I'm in strategy and planning, which at times feels like it could be all sorts of things. I mean, the general day job has always been trust strategy development, internal strategy development around a lot of our services. So, for example, learning disabilities or workforce, so adding capacity to support that. But then particularly in the last few years, with the government's support for integrated care systems and the joining up of health and care, a lot more partnership working actively with other NHS organisations, local authorities, GPs, voluntary community sector and wider. When the COVID pandemic really started, I was a number of people in the trust effectively succumbed to a COVID response team, and because, as I'll come on to, you know, obviously we didn't have necessarily anything in place for that, or people in place for that. So there were a number of us that were put together to support that. But so what I'm going to talk about is just a few quick slides about the structure of our response and a quick initial timeline for what we went through to how we set it up. It was just for the first year or so of timeline. I've done a selected one because I was then involved in the recovery work and then the vaccine rollout. And when I've done my couple of slides, because they're only short, I'll hand over to Ros, who's far more interesting and knowledgeable about health and wellbeing than me, and she'll go through what the trust has been working on and looking at and supporting around developing health and wellbeing and support for staff at Oxford Health. So as I said, like much of the NHS, you know, Oxford Health drew on and adapted and then developed existing emergency planning arrangements. So we have quite extensive emergency planning requirements required of us from legislation, NHS England and improvement. And we have all those sorts of things for as foreseeable emergencies as we can. So recently we triggered ones around fuel and the impact on fuel for staff, agency workers, and so on and so forth. So when in late January, that public health emergency of international concern was announced by WHO, Oxford Health, that was effectively a trigger for a lot of organisations. So Oxford Health activated its influenza pandemic plan because that was at the time the nearest information that we had, and it matched most, I suppose, most accurately with what we knew at that time about coronavirus and a sort of respiratory pandemic. So that effectively was the trigger for formal starting work for the Trust's response to the onset of COVID-19. Following day, NHS England required all organisations to complete an insurance response, and I suppose that was the beginning of NHS England's kind of coordination of what individual trusts and individual organisations in the NHS were doing. The Trust then established a weekly coronavirus response group with a terms of reference and a lead. And as I said, very much at this time, there was a lot that was tremendously uncertain. We had a lot of reports and information from Europe and the rest of the world. There was uncertainty about the extent and sort of the readiness of the UK for levels of coronavirus infections. But over February, it became quite clear that we'd have to put in place some quite significant response arrangements. And in late February, the Trust held our emergency planning team ran a tabletop exercise for pandemic influenza and emergency planning response to that. So our Trust executive, a lot of our clinical leads were involved in that. And the idea behind that was to really inform modelling of infections, particular vulnerable groups and response options. Following that, early March, our executive approved suspension of all non-essential activities, redirection of resources, allocation of ICT equipment to enable virtual working. So I suppose that was a big shift in terms of what the organisation was doing in terms of readiness for support for and meeting the demand of coronavirus. And it also established a much more significant response function. So it was an incident coordination centre, or an ICC, and we had those twice daily from early March. So one in the mornings and then one about 1 o'clock. And the idea was that would be the primary coordination group across the Trust for escalations relating to coronavirus response. So hopefully we could deal with those within tactical command, as it was known. So gathering and actioning escalations, and then that would escalate things it couldn't fix within the tactical command space to strategic command, which was effectively our Trust executive. And strategic command also then linked into regional and national response groups, which were also getting up at that time and aligning with local authority emergency planning arrangements. Early May, so it feels very strange to sort of skip over that quickly, because sort of March and April were very intense time in terms of response. But by early May, we'd reduced them down to just once a day, those ICC meetings. There was a lot of things had become established. A number of things around PPE supply, for example, had gone from a requesting situation to a national push supply. So a lot of the things that we were trying to deal with, we'd addressed. So we still had them once a day, and that reduced to just twice a week, but only in July. Late June, the Trust, we started an active recovery group. I put it in speech because there was quite a lot of debate about, the recovery was quite the right word. That was a a group that we started to commence recovery from the initial response phase. So looking at backlog of services that had been reduced or turned off effectively, and impact on staff, and looking at particularly that's the health and wellbeing bit that Rod can talk about. However, November time, responding to rising infections, we stepped the ICC meetings back up to twice weekly. That continued until February this year. And then in March this year, we resumed recovery activity and stepped down the ICC tactical and strategic meetings. Although they are still in place, they've just been stepped down. So we're still in that phase, we've just stepped them down. And ongoing recovery work across all sorts of service areas we've been looking at since then. So that's just an initial first year of timeline. Subsequently, I was involved in ongoing recovery work and the vaccine rollout. But if I could have the next slide, I can show you effectively the structure of these tactical command groups. The aim of them really was to create a balance between being quite a focused group and small enough to cover a lot of information in a short time, and to have all the key people to respond and address escalations if possible, but striking a balance between that and then ensuring full trust coverage. And I think mostly we got there. So this group evolved over time, but these were effectively the positions on that ICC group. So we obviously had the service areas for Oxford Health, and for those of you who don't know, Oxford Health is a mental health specialist provider, and we also do community services, which are physical services delivered in community settings, so non-acute services. So that's broadly our service grouping. We also have learning disabilities and autism services and dentistry. So NHS organisations are a little bit of an accident of history sometimes in terms of the services that they have, given that things are and outgoing done by contracts. So that's that. But mental health is about 70% of our service provision, and we also obviously have the pharmacy aspect of the services. So they're the service level reps, and then we had the supporting membership. So infection prevention control, human resources, learning and development. That was particularly in there for a lot of the training that we developed and issued to support staff in response to coronavirus. And there was quite a lot of guidance coming down from Health Education England and NHS England in terms of training and guidance relating to staff procedures. Health and wellbeing and psychosocial support, which obviously Ros will talk about in more detail. We also had staff side, so that was union representatives across the trust. Procurement and finance, big part of that was PPE. That team did a really quite amazing job in terms of securing PPE, and a lot of working with partner organisations around mutual aid and support of PPE. Communications were there, estates. In particular, they were involved in looking at how the trust could adapt its estate models to ensure social distancing and infection prevention control. So a lot of beds had to be non-used effectively to create the space and square meterage for treating patients in enclosed environments. Quality and governance, and then ICT, which was a big part of getting remote working, played a big part in obviously the digital consultation rollout that we had. So that's all I probably wanted to say about that. I'm happy to take questions later on, and also about recovery group and what we're looking at doing at the moment. But as I say, a big part of this group was the health and wellbeing of staff and the psychosocial response support that we were trying to focus on and have a particularly strong focus during this group. So at that point, I could hand over to Ros.
Thank you, Ben. That's great. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So thank you for inviting me today. It's a real privilege to be here and to share some of the fantastic work that our colleagues across not just Oxford Health, but all the NHS services across Thames Valley have been doing throughout this time. So yes, I heard Carole and I heard Ben talking about our great staff and our heroes. Believe you me, from folk on the ground, they did not feel like heroes. And in fact, I'd say all the applause and all the expectation, it felt like an additional burden on clinicians that they were being classed as heroes. And actually what it did inadvertently was it had some negative impact where folk felt even more of a struggle to speak up and say they were struggling. So to say just at the start, specifically for Oxford Health, when the pandemic hit, and it was very clear that either folk had to move their roles and work in different inpatient or outpatient areas or community areas or work remotely, the anxieties were really intense. A lot of were around the PPE, which was it wasn't, we were clear in our organisation what was happening, but then what happened 2 and 3 times a day coming down from national, they would change. And they were changing for the right reasons, because as more information came in and more expertise was available, they were sending it down to the local trust, which is great. But what it did was it actually increased folks' anxieties. People were worried about what they might be asked or expected to do. There was people who felt guilty for maybe having an underlying health condition and they were being asked to work remotely, whereas really they were clinical or they were used to working in the front line, and they were being asked to sit at home, not to do nothing. They were being asked to use their expertise, but internally they were translating that into, oh, you know, this real guilt feeling. There was a bit of fragmentation within teams, mainly driven out of fear, where some folk thought, well, they're sitting at home and they're safe, and I'm coming in here every day and I'm worried. So we had that to deal with. And what a lot of things was clear communication, but also real practicalities. So, you know, right at the beginning, if we all remember, it was like there was no food on the shelves. Folk were scared to go on transport. So again, within Oxford Health, we were very quick and very lucky to have really good collaborative working across all our different systems. So we had food brought in for staff who couldn't go out. We were able to almost rely on a lot of our community services who were delivering food into the organisation. We had a great charity input where we were delivering real basics of food to each what in-house areas like wards, but also maybe where they had to have folk in offices in but couldn't get food, etc. We were delivering all of that. One of the other key things that we've sort of implemented very quickly, and it was a different approach that I was used to, being a clinician by background and working in occupational health, I would be saying to people, you know, we can get through this, we will come out the other end, and trying to calm people down. But in the pandemic and working closely with our psychologists, it became very clear we need to get information out to prepare our colleagues for what may be coming down the line and what may be worst case scenarios. And we put a lot of work and effort into that. And that actually had quite a calming effect on people and on teams that, you know, this may be coming, but we are working to the best of our ability to get things in place to either mitigate it or to support, and that we can put plans in place. And all this was very, very fluid because we were almost reactive, whereas in the NHS we like to be a bit more proactive. So it was all very new, but we were working and we were recognising that the majority of our staff were, we want to do the right thing. There was, you know, as much as I'm saying folk were anxious, there was also a great feeling of camaraderie and folk going over and above. A lot of red tape was cut out, so decisions and funding and getting the materials was almost instantaneous, and that was good. But conversely, we had folk who were petrified to leave their kids, vulnerable elderly at home. They were coming into work and what am I taking home? So all this was playing out, and it was playing out in the media as well and in social, so that was impacting. But what we did do was we went right back to basics. We went right back to, okay, we've got a cohort of folk who are working remotely. We've got people who are working intensely on the inpatient areas or in the community. How are we going to start to work with this? So again, brilliant collaboration with our IT, and we get everyone set up who needed to be set up with IT. Not being an IT bot, can I just say they were fantastic. It was like ABC language. This is how you do things. This is how you do Teams. From the psychological support element, we put lots of support in to enable teams still to communicate and to click and to do virtual or in the moment huddles and to ask and more importantly listen to what people were saying. So if they were struggling with things at home, how could we help? And when we're saying how could we help, we were bringing HR in who were also going over and above to try and preempt and put things in place that would support folk across, you know, stepping into their own life and their own personal life as well as work life. And you might call it work-life balance, but you know, it was that real dilemma of folk were going over and above in the workplace and then trying to make it okay in the home as well. And that worked, you know, it was working well. It looked really good as we went through the first pandemic. During the summer months, what we started to experience as we were going into a bit of the recovery was folk were starting to reflect. And through that reflection, they were getting quite, why didn't the organisation do this? Why didn't the government do this? And it was starting to be targeted either at the organisation or at individuals in their team. And we were, again, we'd prepared folk for this. We were well equipped for that. We did have lots of healthcare support going to our staff members. But it wasn't a lot of new stuff. It was a lot of what we already knew. It was a lot of drawing on our psychological colleagues and utilising their expertise. And then, just by chance, through a lot of networking with regional teams and national teams, which we done constantly throughout the first wave of the pandemic, there became a bid available, and you could actually bid for additional money to support your system, which is the Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and Berkshire integrated care system called Bob, but no one seems to know who this Bob guy is. And we were really, really lucky that we got awarded some money to do a cross-system working. So can we go on to the next slide, please? And as part of getting this money, what we were able to do, Oxford Health and then across the whole system, was to start to look at, okay, we have evidence-based to say we know from a wellbeing perspective that national teams, regional teams and teams within the trust, they all have the right resources to support wellbeing. But what we don't know is we don't know if it's reaching the right people. We don't know if folk even know they're there. We don't know if folk who utilise them, if they're the right things. So how can we look to make life easier, make life better and have a bit more consistency across the patch? So one of the first things that we did as a system, and for Oxford Health, was we utilised a thing called the Health and Wellbeing Framework, which comes from National. And that was great, and it gave us a RAG rating. But what it didn't tell us was, okay, this is what you offer, how does it impact? So again, what we did, we went back, we drilled down data, and yes, data can tell you so much and you can triangulate it, but we get out on the ground, which was quite difficult during COVID, but we got out, we really listened to what people were saying. We purposely targeted what we knew as hard to reach groups, but we only knew what we knew. By going out on the ground, we were able to then identify some other groups who we didn't even know were hard to reach. So that was, it gave us both quality and quantitative data. We then looked at, as a group, a working group, how are we going to best utilise this money? So the first thing we did was we brought in a project manager. We put extra resources, as in human resources, into each of the organisations to work with their health and wellbeing lead. We then said and agreed as a group, we know the support's there. We already know and we've identified we need to support managers, middle managers, to help deliver and empower health and wellbeing. How are we going to do that? How are we going to get that vehicle moving? And what approach are we going to take? And what we did was we decided to explore and start to implement a health and wellbeing preventative and proactive approach. So as well as offering like real basics and saying, you know, you must take your lunch breaks, trying to encourage regular tea breaks, offering managers education and support in relation to wellbeing, we also asked very senior managers to stop and look at what tasks were managers doing. Is there something that they could take away from managers to enable them to learn about health and wellbeing, to enable them to step back and look at conversations? How do you have good conversations? How do you have difficult conversations? So whilst we were exploring all that, what we decided to do was we looked at trying to unpick, you know, take some of the pandemic out, because a lot of the information that we've got is a lot of the reasons people are seeking support and guidance now is not necessarily because of the emotional impact in the pandemic. Some is, but a lot of it was happening pre-pandemic. And what the pandemic's done is polarized it. Then you add in the sheer physical exhaustion, and you add in some of the emotional exhaustion. And what we've got is, well, you know, what's going on here? So we were trying to unpick, and when you start to unpick the majority of things, that was the I'm trying not to use the word root cause. The cause was poor behaviours, blame culture, negative cultural attitudes across the system. And we have evidence that that happens across healthcare, not just in this country, but across the world. But what's changed now is they have the evidence to prove what poor culture, how poor behaviours can impact on not only an individual's cognitive ability to engage, but their general well-being, and ultimately how that impacts on patient safety. So we started to look at, okay, this preventative and proactive culture, and what we've done across the system, we've started to introduce and train up, and we've actually trained up 77 people across the system on a new approach. It's called a restorative just and learning culture, and it's about how do we learn from mistakes, how do we change the language, how do we, instead of saying, Roz, you did this, you're to blame, bump. It's about where in the system did this go wrong, how can we learn from it. It's not a pink and fluffy, you know, there's still processes there. If someone's done something that was negligent, then we look to support them, but there's also policies and processes there. So that was something that we've introduced. We've also started to look at civility and respect about behaviours and the impact that has on individuals. And we are very clear about a learned culture. So again, we're starting to put out some visuals and some information across the system about what does good conversations look like, and caring and supportive conversations. And to support that work, we've trained up 80 people across the system on mental health first aid training. And I know that some separate organisations, including ours, were already doing that. So there's obviously more than 80 across the system, but it's something that we've invested in. We've also invested in 5,000 spots for REACT training, which again is to help something that's coming down from national about wellbeing conversations. So it's about managers really saying, you know, how are you? How can we help? But having more in-depth conversations. It's nothing that's documented. It's not mandatory, but it's about opening up and trying to get a bit of a better work-life balance, a bit of better understanding, and then we can progress on to workbooks if need be. But it's also about having that opportunity to signpost should you need to signpost. We also have set up across the whole system a cohort of champions. Again, a lot of organisations, and we have 180 in our organisation at the moment, but it's about making it come from the system so it's equitable and it's a good vehicle that at local level we can share all the good stuff that's coming out of health and wellbeing. More importantly, folk can feed up to the centre on what's working well locally, what's not working well. Can we just go on to the next slide, please? We would never be able to do all this work without collaborative working, and that's, you know, I know it might sound flippant, collaborative working. Honestly, working with like-minded people, getting expertise across the board, no one should ever be ashamed about doing it. As at the November 2020, NHSE and I gave out or awarded money to each of the systems to set up mental health and wellbeing hubs. And across our system, we're really lucky to have two. We have You Matter and we have Wellbeing Matters. And this enables healthcare workers to approach healthcare professionals straight away. They do not need to have a diagnosis. They don't even need to identify if they're stressed or anxious. It's if they just don't feel quite right, they can go there and they can have 30 to 40-minute conversation. If needs be and if agreeable, they can go through for rapid assessment. They do not get prioritised for into rapid care through systems or through services, but they do get somewhere to listen. They get tips, advice, guidance, and they get signposted. Now, some of the other things that we are doing about this psychological safety, I've spoke about the wellbeing conversations, restorative just culture, civility and respect, and the kindness into action is about some little tools. So when we have conversations with others, we don't say, why did you do that? We take ownership ourselves, and, you know, and it's about saying, you wrote this email in this way, that made me feel, and I take ownership. But it's about sharing and having the conversation and trying to improve better behaviours. Some of the stuff we've done specifically in Oxford Health, we've restarted our Schwartz Rounds, which is conversations that anyone across the trust can have. We were doing them online, we're now back to doing them face to face. You get in a group, someone will speak, it's multidisciplinary, someone will speak about a situation they've been through and the emotional impact. And it's not about coming up with how do you make it better, how do you improve policies, etc. It's about just sharing the impact of the emotion. And by doing that, what we've learned, and this work's all evidence-based, is it starts to say, do you know what, I'm probably a bit normal that I did feel like this, and this is other routes that you can go to help diffuse and the impact on that. As I say, we have about the mental health first aid, the react and the trauma. Can we just go on to the next slide, please? So what I'd say really is at the end of all this, we've got lots of support, but actually it's about, we can do the preventative and proactive, but at the moment it's about real basics. And some of the stuff we have done is we have moved on to how do we make this easier. And I think, you know, I think it might have been David was talking about in the work environment where folk go health and wellbeing or mental health first aid or EDI lower down the chain. What we have heard, and I actually heard it this morning from Richard Payton, who works at national level on the Health and Wellbeing Board, is as long as in organisations you can start to take some of your data and show that that's going to impact on the quality of your staff through what you do in wellbeing, you'll start to get more businesses take on this approach. And what we're trying to do now is we are following the people plan. If you go on to the next slide, please, and the people promise, who have made a commitment to improve the quality of NHS staff and their health and wellbeing through the people promise. And this is what we've done, and this is really just a snapshot of an Oxford Health, our health and wellbeing offers, and behind each box is all the key things. And then if you go on to the next slide, please. And this was just an example, as we had a blue one for the start of the pandemic. This was when we moved through our phases. And again, it was just really all the different support, easily recognised, trying to make it simple, not overly fancy. Folk could get to where they wanted. And that's really about it. All I'd say is, you know, it's about, it cuts across not just NHS, any organisation, excuse me, caring, compassionate conversations, taking the time to listen to your staff. And for David's colleague, if we took out folk who had a little bit of mental health, we'd have no staff left to work. That's it from me. I'll pass over now to Carole.
Thank you very much, Ros, and thank you very much, Ben. I mean, that was a masterly synopsis of what goes on in a well-functioning NHS organisation. I mean, Ben's description of the operational strategy that was employed in Oxford is an excellent example of how the NHS has responded, I hope, across the board. It looks very much like the stuff we're doing up north. And you know, the way that you apply what comes down, as it were, from the central body is really what counts. And I have to say that I'm hugely impressed with the emphasis that Ros particularly has given to the ability to listen and to find out and to verify that they are actually doing all the stuff that they need to do. I was fascinated with the idea of actually checking that you had actually reached everybody who needed to be reached. And I suppose the question I would ask at this stage, and I can happily wait for later because I know Lisa's nearly ready, is how did you know who were the people who were being missed? Were there surprises there? Because I think I caught from you that there were people you didn't know. So I would really be interested to know that, but I will ask that question at the end, Ros. Thank you very much. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa. Lisa is a chartered psychologist and psychotherapist, and she uses the wonderful word, she's a down-to-earth one, which I think is a wonderful description and not one that I would automatically apply to my psychotherapy friends, I have to tell you. Lisa has founded an organization called It's Time for Change, and this is to support organizations to become places where employees excel, where the teams are dynamic and people are happy. And what a wonderful description of I hope, all the places that she will enable us to work in. So Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Carole. So I'm going to start with a question, which is to ask you to think individually, what have you done this week to make a difference to well-being in your company? And was that something that you consciously planned, or did it just happen? So I want to talk a little bit today about leading a well-being culture with intention. And I think I use that word very deliberately. I think I've seen in companies I've been working with quite limited evidence of people going about the whole wellbeing agenda at a leadership level in terms of thinking about the whole wellbeing agenda. And the current climate, we know with the number of vacancies, job vacancies, and what we're hearing from workplaces and people calling out their employers, that actually if people aren't feeling well in their organisation, they're much more likely to walk. The tide has definitely changed in terms of well-being. So if you think back to my dad's view, who always used to question my job, which says, you know, people have got a job, they should just be happy with that. And I think it's now turned more from just being grateful you've got a job to thinking about satisfaction, then it moved to engagement, and now we think much more about employee experience. And it makes sense that if we focus on the day-to-day experience of employees, then we are building good well-being. So when I talk to people about how they're going about thinking about well-being for their employees, I try to encourage them not just to think about well-being, but to think about everything around it. And Ros has just been describing brilliantly how that's been the case in the NHS and how joined up that's been. So she's been describing what I'm going to be talking about brilliantly in terms of practice. So I guess the question is, if we're looking at it in a holistic way, whose responsibility is well-being? And I see it too often still being pigeonholed. So it's something, it's an HR thing, or it's occupational health, or it's for mental health first aiders, or it's a particular initiative. But I think we know, and if we stop and just think about it for a moment, we know that, for employees to be their best, for them to thrive, for them to be able to perform, to enjoy their experience of being at work and feel good about their achievements and proud about their company, then that is integral to the whole employee experience. And that then makes well-being very much a leadership issue. And that requires leaders to be very self-aware in terms of being mindful about themselves and where their well-being is at and how to look after themselves. It needs to be very much about strategy. And we've heard from Ros and Ben about how they've developed a strategy that really focuses around their people. And we need to be conscious about challenging that narrow perception of well-being and making it a much broader area of focus. So I'm going to move a slide on. Oh, my slide has stuck. There we go. So when you hear about the term well-being, what do you think about? And I think it's a useful question to ask your colleagues, because if you're someone who's regular on these webinars, you might have quite a broad idea about what well-being really means. But I think we need to check out the understanding of people within our teams, within our company. People often describe well-being as something about just kind of feeling well, or they relate it to something specific around mental health. But the Global Wellness Institute has come up with a really useful definition, which is one that's about being active and conscious in terms of planning for and having a strategy around health and well-being. So it's something about actively engaging in a process that moves people towards well-being. And I think it's a good quote to prompt questions about how aware are you and everyone within your organisation about well-being, and how are you actively planning for it? And that's across your whole organisation, and that's everyone having a clear idea then about what their particular role is, because you need to be consciously shaping your business in terms of for it to be fit for the future, in terms of looking at the people at the heart of it. So when we think about everything where we are right now, and I think this has been, Carole's talking about this earlier, there's been a huge amount of change working through the pandemic. And we know that, it's the amount of sort of day-to-day variation that's happened, and on a personal basis, but within the companies as well, has been staggering. And 19 months ago, or however long it was when this all started, for most of us, there were so many webinars around. I mean, we were being inundated with webinars around mental health and well-being. But for me, they still focus quite a lot on, and I think it was necessary at that point, they focused a lot on individual well-being, about self-care, about how to look after ourselves and realise when we weren't in a great place. And we need to be able to do that because there's so many people under a lot of pressure or working remotely. But I think now the time has come, as we move beyond the pandemic, to shift that focus to being much broader and look at the relationship between change and well-being. And that's a specific area that I work quite a lot with, because we know that change has a huge impact on how we feel about ourselves, about how we feel about our ability to engage in the company, and just be ourselves in our day-to-day. So if you think about some of the kind of areas that you might have been looking at within your companies, and if you haven't been looking at some of these, then actually it might be a time to kind of hit the pause button in terms of focusing on new processes and sort of new ways of doing things in terms of moving forward when we look at systems and so on, and actually just start to look at going back to the basics. And when we think about, what are we about now as a company, what is our vision now? Because it's no good just picking up where we were before. In terms of values, a lot of people's personal values have changed since the pandemic. Are we making sure that those are still aligned with where the company's at? And, it doesn't take a psychologist to tell you that if employees' experience is positive, if they're going to work or engaging with work in a way that feels that they're part of, that they feel that they're recognised, where they have a really positive experience, and that's going to have a really positive impact on their well-being. And that's reciprocal. So rather than just focusing on people's well-being and having initiatives focus very much on self-care and so on, it's about the bigger picture. And I think we often forget that it's everything we do that impacts on people's well-being. It's not just a specific mental health first aider training initiative or a workshop or a mental health bulletin, but it's about all the conversations we have. It's about the support we're offering. And I think, it's about managers. When we look at, one of the examples I've got here is about manager competence and capability. And I was pleased to see that Ros had referred to that as well. 68% of managers, in a report I was reading recently, consider themselves accidental. So are they in the best place to be able to support teams emotionally? And if data also suggests that the wellbeing of employees who have such an accidental manager are impacted by increased stress 15% of the time, low mood 24% of the time, and poor engagement 14% of the time. And that's a really good example of one small part of the overall picture that is often neglected, where companies often fail to invest in that particular part of the big picture, but it can make such a massive difference to well-being. So it's about sort of hitting the pause button and thinking, what is it in our company that impacts most on well-being of our employees? So some of you who've heard me speak before might be familiar with the iceberg analogy, because I like this and I use this a lot. When we think about the people we work with, think about our colleagues, what do we observe? And actually, how are you presenting yourself? So what are your teammates like in terms of, appearing to be okay, appearing to be present and getting on with things? And is that genuine, or are they wearing a mask? And what's the cost of people wearing a mask and appearing present and appearing to be coping with everything, when actually underneath there might be a lot of other things going on? One question I know has been asked in advance of this webinar was about supporting veterans in the workplace when they're being triggered by the news about what's going on in Afghanistan. And I think that's a really, really good question. And a lot of employers, a lot of leaders, managers don't know well enough who the people are really in their teams. They know that they've also been through an interview process and they've got a job and what their role is now. But in terms of what their history is, we need to know we need to really know people, and we need to know what affects them on a day-to-day basis. Because if you've got someone who is experiencing pattern matching to the news, that's increasing their emotional arousal, whether that's PTSD or whether it's just taking up some of their emotional and cognitive capacity, we know that it's going to impact on their day-to-day well-being and it's going to impact on their performance. So we need to understand at a personal level the people that we're working with. And we need to be having the conversations, again, that Ros was talking about, when we notice that people aren't themselves, asking them about it and just commenting and wondering how you can help. So it's showing you value people rather than you're judging them. I would also ask you to think about whether you're noticing resistance. And again, we had some examples about the sort of negative behaviours we might be seeing, such as people feeling a bit awkward or dragging their feet, or appearing challenging, appearing defensive. And that's a natural part of human behaviour. And I think when people are going through change, we tend to forget that resistance is a normal part of that process. So if you think that most people, pretty much everyone, has been going through a situation where we are working differently, whatever that might look like, we need to stop and we need to understand that the people who are appearing to be challenging or a bit difficult to engage, rather than shying away from those people, or rather than feeling frustrated by them or labeling them as difficult, and I've had lots of conversations with people who talk about difficult members of staff, it's actually about understanding what that resistance is about and reframing that as those are behaviours which are normal responses. and to actively look for those signs of resistance and to seek to understand them, because they are going to be communicating anxiety about change. They don't know how they fit in, what the future looks like, and so on. And as soon as we start to understand that resistance and embrace that and engage with that in a way that's normal, it builds trust and it builds confidence. And that means that leaders and managers and the whole workforce is much more aligned, and it reduces that resistance. We have to understand that people's reality is very personal. So what I might get bothered by is something completely different to what someone else might get bothered by. So the questions that people will have front of mind, again, aren't rocket science, but these are really basic questions that need to be addressed. They need to be given space to be asked. They need to be given space to be opportunities to be answered. People need to know the why. They need to know that it's safe to make mistakes when we're going through change, we're trying new things. They need to know they're going to be supported. So leaders need to understand, for example, the emotional cycle of change, because if they don't understand the emotional impact and the emotional journey that people will be going through, then they can be trying to put into place amazing new processes and ways of working and so on. But actually, if people aren't on board, they're not likely to succeed. And if we are ignoring our workforce, if we're not taking into consideration, giving them opportunities to ask the questions about the what next, this has been the last 19 months or so, this is how we used to do things, but what's the future look like? Then people are much more likely to have or to experience increased emotional arousal, and that's much more likely to increase their resistance and then potential burnout. So we have to actively look for these signs, and we have to actively try and reduce people's anxiety by giving them space. And that comes back to that sense of culture that we've heard a lot about from Ros and Ben in terms of psychological safety, having the ability for people to be able to ask questions and make mistakes, and a place where leaders are able to model with confidence, because they believe and they know and they feel supported themselves in what's happening next, and they're able to say, well, we don't know, or actually we thought it might be this and it turns out to be something different. So that culture is so important. And it's really, if you think about, when you brush your teeth with one hand naturally, put your toothbrush in your other hand and try and brush your teeth, it gets really, really clunky. And I think when we understand how on a really simple level change impacts us and how it makes us have to focus quite a lot more on something that's really, really basic, then change that to being in the workplace where you're asking people to be doing something much more complicated, much more sophisticated, and getting their head around that change. We don't have the neural connections there. It takes a lot of conscious effort to do things differently. So what does good look like? Well, if we're thinking about we want people to be well, we want people to be coming to work and engaging in a way that they can be their best and they feel good and they're able to be open and honest and so on, we need to be really clear about what we're looking for. And I think too often we talk about we want people to experience good well-being, but we don't know what that actually looks like. We don't know what that means. And so if we need to be clear about what a number 10 looks like, for example, what does that look like? What are the behaviours we'd be observing? What does that feel like? How empowered are people to be able to speak up, and do they really understand what their role is now as we move forward? Do they know what the boundaries are? Are they recognised for their contribution to developing? Are there opportunities for growth? So we have to be very clear about what number 10 looks like, and we have to be clear about what number 1 looks like. And that's number 1's not necessarily about being overwhelmed. Number 1 could be about being bored. I know some people who are feeling incredibly stressed at the moment and, on the verge of burnout are thinking, how can people be bored? But there are companies who haven't been busy, are understimulated, and that also causes emotional arousal to increase. Our brains don't like being bored. And so, our brains respond in a way which is about driving action, driving us to do something different. So we need conversations to acknowledge that and to explore that. And when we start to be very clear about what we think is the ideal and where we are now, think for yourself about where you put your company, and importantly, where other people would put you, whether that's your employees, your clients, stakeholders. Think about where you are and where you want to be, and how you start to move along, and use your data, use your metrics. Where are people in your company unhappy and why? Because if you don't know that, you can't put into place good strategies to make a difference. And what does your data say about where people are underperforming? Because you need to be clear about where people are underperforming. Maybe that's to do with a particular team because the manager doesn't have the confidence to support. It could be a whole host of reasons, but we need to look at the data that we have to hand to inform our wellbeing strategy. And then that moves us on finally to actually looking at how we think about the big picture as we move forward out of the pandemic. We have to start joining the dots, because wellbeing, as I said earlier, can be so easily pigeonholed into kind of one person's role. One person should be taking responsibility, but actually we have to start very much joining the dots and having a strategy around that, just as Ben and Ros were explaining. And if we look at the example of managers again, they're people who have had so much pressure on them without necessarily having adequate support from their leaders, the people above them. And they're expected to take the strain and to be able to put into place a whole new way of working, even though they are human and possibly also experiencing overwhelm and out of their comfort zone as well. So we know that senior leaders need to be investing in their managers to be able to understand and better support their own well-being, and to be able to shape their role to be able to do that. So it was great hearing the example of managers' roles in the NHS were looked at in terms of taking something away so that they could spend more time focusing on the wellbeing side. And I think that's really, really important. And they need support and training to be able to understand signs of themselves and signs of people in their teams that things are not right, and how to go about having good conversations where they feel confident and to be able to have those sensitive conversations. And, examples, again, that Ros was talking about work-life balance, and whether we call it work-life integration, flexible working, whatever we call it, is, again, that's not just a HR issue or a manager issue. And it's about teams being able to work together and work out ways that work for them really well. McLaren's a great example of that, where I read a report where their teams are able to work out their own set of goals to work towards without having set targets set from above. So it's not about ticking boxes. This is about very much getting people right to get the business right. And that's about their whole experience. Everyone in an organisation has a role to play, whatever that might be. And so I'd leave you with a suggestion, which is to revisit your strategy and to consciously plan for well-being to be embedded throughout your organisation, where each person in your organisation at every single level has a responsibility and a part to play. I shall hand you back to Carole.
Thank you very much, Lisa. You are truly practical, as you suggested. I really liked this presentation. I thought this was enormously helpful, and the point about not pigeonholing, that it is all the people talking all together, which is such an important part of it, and that one shouldn't be looking towards somebody to fix it. We should all be part of the fixing it, as it were, as we go forward. I also particularly like the idea of resistance being normal human behavior. And I think it's very interesting to look at the vaccine behaviors within the country as being a classic example of how do you deal with resistance and understanding it and supporting it. I was also very interested in how you took an organizational approach and incorporated into that so much of the stuff that Ros and Ben had said, which was, you have an organizational skeleton, as it were, but then within that, there are individual things that can be done that can help. So thank you very much indeed, Lisa. Okay. I'm going to actually hand over to Claire now at this stage. Claire is going to help us through the Q&A session. And I think she has a store of questions. I've certainly got hundreds, but I will not take the prerogative.
Thank you, Carole, and thank you, Ben, Ros, and Lisa. That was. I cannot pretend I don't have a puppy on my lap. I literally started barking. Apologies. Sorry. Apologies. So my first question is to Ros. What advice do you have for line managers how to recognise the signs of mental health mental ill health, and also how to best keep in contact with direct reports if they are out on sick leave due to mental health issues. This is sometimes very challenging, yet is so important in keeping the lines of communication open and understanding how the employee is feeling and what support they may need. Again, apologies for the noise in the back. Literally, everyone's just arrived home as I went on. Apologies, Ros. But I've sent you the question already, so hopefully.
Yeah, don't worry. Thank you, Claire, and great to hear you've got a normal life in the background. It's great. Okay, how to recognise mental health. You know, a lot of it's what Lisa was saying. If you invest and get to know your own staff and understand your staff, and it can't be a sit down, right, Claire, tell me, have you had mental health issues in the past? That's not what we mean. You have to ensure a safe space and trust in conversations with your staff and getting to know and understand them, which is great if you can go down that path. But you may be at the stage now, you don't have a clue or a scooby about what's going on with your staff member, but you do know that they're just slightly out of character, or their workload's not quite right, or they're being a bit withdrawn. And these are all indicators for you to have the conversation, you know, a nice, caring, supportive conversation, and be honest with them. I've noticed this. Is there anything I can help with? Here's some signposting. And it may be that the next step is, do you know what? Why don't we refer you off to occupational health, where you can have that confidential space and support to discuss? So that's one element. The communication side, I'm really, really a strong believer in. We should have good communication with our staff when they're off. And I'll come from two different elements. I know some policies and processes say once a week or once every fortnight, or it could be seen as bullying and harassment. Make it nice, make it clear that you're only phoning, and you might understand that they don't want to respond, but I'm phoning because I care and that I'm here when you feel ready to come to me. There's nothing to stop you sending a little card that just says, I understand, but when you're ready and in the right place, I'm here to support. And the other bit of advice, and I used to give this when I worked in occupational health, was to say, sorry, I'm picking on you, Claire. Claire, you're going off. And, you know, sometimes you can be so fragile when you're off, for whether it's stress or an identified mental health condition, anything. You feel when your manager phones, they're walking into your living room. And what I used to say to people was, write in a post-it, you know, thank you for calling. I feel really vulnerable at the moment, but I will call you in a week, 10 days. And in a way, you're taking a bit of control back, but you're letting them know as well. And then what I'd say to managers is, you may expect them to say this to you, please respect it, but please also find other routes of communication, because when someone is starting to recover, they can look back and go, my manager really did care. And this is what it's about.
That's fantastic, Ros. Thank you. And Ros, I was really struck in when you were speaking about, I'm just not long out of the NHS, going back in soon, but about your the guilt that people felt around the clapping. And I know certainly, like on our street's WhatsApp, it was on Thursday night, everyone was going, is everybody going out to clap, you know? And, you know, you mentioned about that for some people was a barrier in terms of coming forward to get additional support. So has that resolved now, or is that still feeling an impact? Because we still see a lot of headlines about the heroic NHS worker.
I think it is still a bit of a barrier. I also think generically a lot of NHS staff don't believe what a lot of folk were clapping for, because there was no support and afterwards, and specifically funding, etc., from the government. That's all I'll say. But we know it's an additional barrier to folk asking for help. And we've known even pre-COVID, healthcare professionals are reluctant to seek help. One, they feel ashamed. Two, you know, and I can relate to this, there's no way I'm going to the GP until I definitely know I've got this, because it might look stupid if I go in and say I think I might have. So you have this conflicting piece. And then there's another element of so many folk need that support. I'm not going to take it away because I know patients might need that more. So I don't think it's disappeared. I think a lot of folk don't talk about it now because it feels almost so long ago. But when folk are vulnerable in the NHS, it's just that little additional burden.
Thank you, Ros. That's excellently answered. Thank you. I'm pleased to say that all noise has now gone from my house. I'm so sorry about that. Okay, question 2. This is for Lisa. And this is a question to say, I'd be interested to know any suggestions for how we can do more to ensure the well-being of our team when we have limited engagement with them due to working from home, and knowing that this will continue with the introduction of hybrid working. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that question.
I can. I have to apologise. I had the door just go because my children just walked in from school as well. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. The obvious part of that, of the obvious response, is about working at how people check in with each other, and not just leaving it to the expectation that managers will be doing that, or there'll be a certain, you know, it's just left to the weekly meeting or whatever that might be in place as standard. But asking people what they would like, and rather than just using the kind of the normal processes, actually setting something up that meets the needs of the team, and knowing that we have to personalize that. So what one person wants might be different to something else. So some people I know be checking with their teams, certain members of their teams, via a WhatsApp message every day. Some people want a face-to-face meeting every day. Some people don't want to hear anything, they just want to be left to get on with it. And I think we have to be very aware of being able to personalise that. We also need to be mindful of challenging the whole idea about resilience. So some companies are saying, that's great, we're going to just always focus on training our teams to become more resilient, so that we trust that they are going to be okay. My worry with that is how some companies will interpret resilience is that we can build them up, or how people might feel about it is we can build them up so that we can throw more at them. And then it's, I think people then end up thinking that it's a sign of weakness if they end up not, having to say at some point, I can't take any more. So I think we have to be very careful of what we expect of people, and actually help people understand what naturally happens with change and emotional arousal, and what those early warning signs are, how to look out for warning signs in each other that something might not be quite right, and having the confidence to be able to say, and to be able to ask and say, I've noticed you're not your usual bubbly self, are you okay? Or just checking with people. So just that sense of self-care, looking out for each other, and also just still having fun and trying to find new opportunities to collaborate as much as possible. So whereas traditional roles, I might be doing something on my own quite a lot, if people are working in hybrids or working kind of remotely, how can we maybe evolve our roles a little bit so that we collaborate a little bit more, so you're not on your own quite so much? And I think where people have done that, they've really benefited and valued having someone else to work alongside.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a fantastic answer. We've had a really great comment from Judy about how people outside the NHS felt quite helpless, and that the clapping was a way for people to feel to help the NHS. So, okay, my third question is for Ben. So this question is, with many employers looking at different approaches to flexible working, some more agile and flexible than others, how can we ensure that we do not return to the older state of physical presence equaling more productive?
I think that's a really good and interesting question. And I think it's actually, it kind of touches on the interface, doesn't it, perhaps, between kind of classic culture of performance management, which is quite technical, quite has become quite process or it has become so in some places. And I think actually what we're talking about here in terms of well-being, and people's how well they feel they're coping at work and what they're able to contribute to. I'm just thinking about, as you asking that question, when I used to work in contracting before being in the NHS, so I'd spent far too much of my time on trains going around the country, but I didn't really have a desk or an office or see people regularly, and so the idea of sort of being present at work in order as a demonstration that you were at work or working was completely gone. And it was something I sort of get back to when I was in the NHS, and these sort of people being at their desks and in order to be at work. For me, I think it's about evolving the performance management, I suppose, into actually something that's a bit more about productivity management. I think there's actually a challenge potentially for managers in probably being quite a lot clearer in terms of their expectations about what a piece of work looks like, the processes for checking in on how it's going. I think it's actually about making kind of performance management a much more kind of humane and kind of dynamic and discursive thing, so people can choose where they work and when they work because they feel confident about the ask, if you see what I mean. And for some of our staff, that's not an immediate concern because you can't always deliver a lot of healthcare remotely, so there's always an element of being present that's required. But we've got a large number of staff in support services that have been at home, working at home or remotely for a couple of years now, and I think we'll continue to do so. And I think in addition to that, I think there'll be the kind of hybrid model of working where people will come in for a couple of days a week. But that's quite a big shift of our use of office spaces. We're probably going to have more kind of hubs to give them a term, smart working arrangements. And I think that the office as was, in terms of you're in and that's your desk, or you're in and that's your group, is different. And I think that's why the interface with well-being is very important. Because I think for a lot of people, the sociable side, and I don't mean that in a kind of in a sort of pejorative way. I just mean that actually people like to come and work with people in teams, feel collaborative in teams. And actually, if that isn't there, or the group of people that you work with regularly aren't there, I think that affects kind of the sense of foundations for people. And I think that's what I mean by the interface between re-evolving a performance management culture that is much more about productivity and kind of the outputs and the outcomes of a bit of work, rather than just, oh, you've been doing it there for 4 hours at that desk because I've seen you do it, which I think looking back on it, I think its days were done, weren't they, that kind of culture, but they were clinging on, and I think the pandemic's really challenged it for people. So but yeah, I think it's about making it a more humane, evolving process, and enabling staff to feel confident to say, I've tried doing it this way, it's not working. What's the advice? And kind of rescoping objectives and indicators.
Thank you, Ben. I have a follow-up question from that, actually, from Ruth Bagley, which is a really good question, which is, how do we ensure equity and a sense of fairness for people who can only or largely deliver their role in person? And of course, the NHS, and maybe Carole will come in on this as well, because that's very pertinent for the NHS. Friends in manufacturing, distribution and personal care may begin to feel second class or as if they're losing out.
Yeah, very much. And we had that most acutely during the pandemic, whereas a good chunk of the workforce could work at home. But obviously, a lot of people couldn't, and you don't want to get a two-tier workforce effectively in those ways. I think the way we've been trying to work around that is to perhaps understand teams that can only be in one ward or in one place, and then to try and kind of have more specific conversations about what that entails and support for that environment, whether that be just quite basic things like parking and lunch breaks and all that kind of what that physical environment is like to work in, you know, to really make that as good as it can be, but then also to, I suppose, be more flexible about working arrangements, so people feel as if they can, you know, I think, look at different roles or in terms of career development or how that looks. But, you know, I think it's a bit early days for us at the moment, because obviously a big part of healthcare is being kind of that physical delivery. I mean, our district nursing workforce is an interesting model for that. You know, they physically have to go and visit people in their homes, but they're very mobile workforce as well. So, you know, we've got quite a lot of different categories of worker, and we're working through that at the moment. But there's been some interesting kind of technical, practical things about recruitment as well, because effectively it does have a knock-on effect. You know, if you're about delivering healthcare for a particular organisation, you're quite locally based. You're not going to drive 3 hours to deliver a care shift. So, you know, you have to be in that immediate area, whereas quite a lot of our support service staff, in theory, can be anywhere in the UK. And that has a knock-on effect on your recruitment campaigns and how people work. And we've even had quite a lot of requests during the pandemic for staff to work abroad, you know, which we've looked at in practical circumstances. But, you know, I think HMRC have some quite strict rules about based in terms of where you pay tax. But, you know, I think in theory, you know, we could have staff all over the UK, which I don't think we're very keen to do, because I think it does, you know, that really does create a kind of a tier type approach. So we're working through it is the short answer, but there's lots of considerations I think that we've had on it.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm going to hand over, because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to hand over to Carole for closing comments, and perhaps she would say something on the final question there as well, if she wanted to add something. Thank you.
Okay, well, first I'd like to thank all our speakers, and also to Claire. Must be a bit like herding cats answering the questions for this. I personally have found this an absolutely fascinating webinar. It's covered so many different bases, but I think at the end I would like to take us right back to David's comment in the beginning, where he made the remark that someone had said to him that poor mental health was equivalent to weakness. And then if you think now about people who may be feeling second-class citizens, or they're losing out, I suppose for me it goes back to what is it that we do that makes people feel that they're not perhaps as good as others. And it is a question about how do we value individuals and on what basis. And it strikes me quite strongly that during the pandemic, yes, we clapped for the NHS workers. 2 weeks later, we added and other support workers. Yeah. But actually the country, all of us would have come to a complete standstill if people collecting rubbish, delivering things to supermarkets, manning the pharmacies, making sure our lights stayed on, weren't doing their job. And yet, do they actually have the same level of esteem and value that other people do? In the same way, do we value people who have different forms of disability? In the same way, I don't think we do. And I was fascinated that there would be areas where we don't reach automatically, and maybe that's focused our mind now. It does seem to me that the pandemic has done many, many things to us, but the re-evaluation is something that if we could have the courage to do it constructively, could make a very significant and positive change to the way we all relate to each other. So I'll leave it at that, and then lots more things to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carole. I knew that this would be a great session in your capable care, and thank you, Ros, Ben, Lisa and Claire for helping us with the Q&A. My closing remarks are an invitation to our audience to have a look at our Mental Wellbeing Charter. It's on our website, which is thamesvalleychamber.co.uk. Click on About and you'll see Mental Wellbeing Charter. This is our framework. These are the questions. These are the commitments that we invite our member organisations and those that are not members to pledge to, which guide our work behind the scenes. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next webinar, we're still arranging a date, but it'll most likely be in the new year, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for your attendance, and without further ado, we'll close there. Thank you. Bye-bye.